So let me start by saying this. I will be taking off from where Roman Navaratnam ended. The points which I will discuss today, since I've only 15 minutes, will focus on the corporate sector. I am going to focus primarily on my area of research, which is on government business ties. Now, I would like to start by bringing back some history, going into some history about Malaysia plans, this particular Malaysia plan, the 12th Malaysia Plan. What is interesting here is when we look at the 12th Malaysia Plan, we have to do a review of the previous Malaysia Plan. That's the 11th Malaysia Plan. The 11th Malaysia Plan was in fact created by Najib Razak under the Barisan Nasional Government. And the midterm review of the 11th Malaysia Plan was done by the Pakatan government, which subsequently also introduced shared prosperity vision. And now we have a new government, the Pakatan government, which is discussing the 12th Malaysia Plan. One point of continuity in all these plans, interestingly enough, is the Minister Mustafa, who was, there's some continuity there because he was privy to the making of all these plans. But before I start my discussion also on what I think about the pending 12th Malaysia Plan, I'd like to make this point. When Najib Razak came to power, it was at a time after the global financial crisis in 2009. And when he looked upon the economy and he spoke to many people in the corporate sector, one key point that was made to him was, we have to do away with the NEP type affirmative action in business. And he himself, after having discussed this matter with a number of people, said, no more affirmative action. This was headlines in the newspapers and the Star. Subsequently, there was a backlash from UMNO. And so he changed it to market-friendly affirmative action. This is in the 10th Malaysia Plan. That market-friendly affirmative action didn't work. If you look at the 11th Malaysia Plan, clearly there's no mention anymore of market-friendly affirmative action. The 11th Malaysia Plan was also introduced after the debacle, the BN debacle in the 2013 general election. So he then said, the infamous statement, "Apa lagi Cina mau," focused his attention on the Bumiputras, and in the 11th Malaysia Plan, he came out with his own affirmative action policy called the Bumiputra Economic Empowerment Policy. I would like to stress this. When Pakatan was in the opposition, in its manifesto, they clearly said, we will move away from race-based policies to those based on needs. When they came to power, they too, like Najib Razak, backtracked. This backtracking can clearly be seen not only in the midterm review of the 11th Malaysia Plan, where they endorsed the BEC, the Bumiputra Economic Empowerment Policy. But if you read the SPV, the Shared Prosperity Vision, you will also see that very clearly there's a stress on race-based policies. Now, this is problematic because look at this diagram. This diagram shows the equity distribution figures which were presented in the SPV. I'd like to remind you, in the 11th Malaysia Plan, unlike previous Malaysia plans, they did not show the equity distribution figures among all Malaysians. Now, what is interesting about this figure is the serious nature of equity distribution in terms of how Malaysia has gone backwards. Now, in 1970, if you look at the Bumiputra figures when the NEP was introduced, Bumiputras owned only 2.4% of corporate equity. It reached a high of 23.4% in 2011, and since then, there's been a remarkable fall in terms of corporate equity owned by Bumiputras. In 2015, it had fallen to 16.2%. I raise this point because I'm asking, with all the efforts to increase Bumiputra equity ownership, why has there been this fall? This was not discussed in the SPV. The second point, if you look at non-Bumiputras, in 1970, they owned 34.3% of corporate equity. It reached a high of 46.8% in 1990. But look at the figure now in 2015. It has fallen remarkably to 30.7%. What that means is Bumiputras today, according to the government, owns less equity today. Non-Bumiputras own less equity today than they did in 1970. So just as the Bumiputras have fallen behind, so too have the non-Bumiputras. So where is the increase? And this is where we go back to, again, 1970, look at foreign equity ownership. It was a high of 63.9% The new economic policy was brought in also to redistribute that wealth cornered by foreigners during colonial rule and to redistribute it more equitably. It fell remarkably to 25.4% in 1990, but now it is shot up to 45.3%. These figures, let me remind you, are for 2015. We are 5 years on. What are the figures now? I'm waiting to see the 12 Malaysia Plan equity distribution figures because they probably, if I'm not mistaken, foreign ownership of corporate equity would have now clearly passed 50%. And I raise this also because I want to bring up the issue of China and China's involvement in the Malaysian economy, but I'll come to that later. But here you can see foreign equity is rising, non-Bumiputra equity is reducing, Bumiputra equity is reducing. All Malaysians, to my mind, are in a serious situation as far as equity distribution is concerned. More so since the government has paid so much attention to it. So let's break this down into now the next diagram. I'm not sure why this next diagram is not coming up. Can you see it? Okay, here we are. Here you can see it more clearly. I'm now trying to show you the corporate sector in Malaysia. The corporate sector constitutes large-scale enterprises of the sort you're seeing here, foreign firms, which some of them are also listed here, the GLCs, which I'll come to, and small and medium-scale enterprises. Here you're only seeing the largest enterprises in Malaysia. And here you can see the outcome of policies such as the new economic policy, which has been in place since 1970s. Now, what you can see here is in red, the largest enterprises in this country are the GLCs. If you look at the top 10, 8 of them are GLCs. If you look at the top 20, nearly half of them are GLCs. If you look at the rest of the companies, what is interesting is in terms of Bumiputra ownership, the Bumiputras have not done well in spite of concerted efforts to make them corporate captains. So here what we can see, the only Bumiputra we can see here is at number 28, AMB Holdings and Bank, which is controlled by Asman Hashim, but even he is relinquishing his stake very soon, I've been told. And it's going to be taken over by a GLIC, a government investment company, that's EPF. The other major company in the top 50 owned by Bumiputra is the well-connected Syed Mokhtar, who owns MNC Corporation. The rest are family-owned companies and foreign-owned enterprises. Now, what I don't have here, and which I would like to discuss very quickly, is the SME sector. The SME sector, let me remind you, constitutes 98.5%. 98.5% of the corporate sector. There are 1.2 million registered firms in this country. If you look at these SMEs, which constitute, as I said, the bulk of companies in this country, 76% of them, of this 98%, 76% of them are micro firms. What that means is about 893,000 companies in this country are micro firms. That means we have 5 employees or less. This is a major structural problem. I have seen nothing so far in the government plans in terms of how we're going to resolve this major structural problem. What is interesting also in the last budget, the finance minister, Tunku Zafrul, said this very clearly. If you look at the budget takes the same ethnic perspective in terms of distribution of concessions under the budget. Majority of the concessions were targeted at Bumiputras. And here's what he also said. Out of these SMEs, 80%, his words, 80% of these SMEs are non-Bumiputra owned, and yet the budget targeted at that 20%. If you read the SPV carefully, what the SPV clearly shows also is in terms of value added for companies owned by the non-Bumiputras, they have not done as well as the non-Bumiputras. Now, I don't like this discussion on Bumiputra and non-Bumiputra dichotomy, but I have no choice but to get into it because that's the discourse of the government. And what I am trying to argue here is I do wish in the 12th Malaysia Plan they will stop this Bumiputra, non-Bumiputra dichotomy and start focusing on the corporate sector as a whole and look at the most dynamic sectors of the economy, the most dynamic enterprises, and target the efforts there because, and here we come to this, the pandemic. What the pandemic has indicated is this. We have a serious problem because in a lockdown, we can't turn to the private firms for help. So who do we turn to? We turn to the government-linked companies. Again, I turn to Tunku Zafrul, the finance minister, when he took power as finance minister. That's when the pandemic hit us, and he referred to the government ecosystem. What is this government ecosystem? This is it, the GLC world. The GLC world really constitutes government-linked companies, such as the government-linked investment companies. We have statutory bodies, we have foundations, we have development financial institutions, the DFIs, such as the SME Bank, the Agro Bank, the Export-Import Bank. These are all important institutions. The statutory bodies were created by law to help alleviate poverty and to redress rural sector backwardness. So you have institutions like FELDA, for example, you have institutions like MARA. These were all created to help, particularly the rural folk, and we have seen that we have not done enough in that area. What is interesting is that Tunku Zafrul said, it is this ecosystem that we are now going to turn to help get this economy back on track. But what is important is that this pandemic clearly indicated to us that the government has an institutional architecture which, if well deployed, can play a major role in dealing with many of the structural problems that we have in this country, including the points raised like rural differences, wealth and income disparities. And here I'm only showing you the GLCs owned by 4 major ministries: the Prime Minister's Department, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Rural and Regional Development, and very importantly today, the Ministry of Science and Technology. Important focus on technology. We have seen already the importance of technology in this new world, where we have to turn to technology as a major tool which we need to use to get the economy going again. Now here, what is interesting is if you look at the budget as well as the stimulus packages that were provided, that were presented to us, what they provided for was that they were going to use these very same institutions to help the economy. So for example, in telecommunications, the GLCs in telecommunications were used to provide the services that we needed. In utilities, the NAGA was going to provide services in terms of reducing the cost of power supply. If you look at the banking sector, the GLC banks were asked to put a moratorium on loans. It clearly indicated that the government had tools which they could use to help sustain this economy. But the problem is, this is a serious problem. How are the GLCs being used? Here we are fortunate, we have this world. But as Mahathir himself said when he was in the opposition, this world has become so big, so huge that even the bureaucrats have no clue how big it is. It's a shadow world. The politicians don't want to cast light on the shadow world because if they do, they have to dispense with the practice of patronage where they appoint politicians to these GLCs, which then get us these titles, which these GLCs get, these politicians get as GLC directors are then channeled into the political system. It's a major source of political financing. I am only showing you the GLC world at the federal level. Let me tell you that at the state level, every state in this country, they have GLCs. They also have institutions known as Chief Minister Incorporated or Mantri Besar Incorporated, which are controlled by politicians as a mechanism to make appointments where, following these appointments, these GLCs can be used to muster support in key constituencies, ostensibly through corporate social responsibility activities. It's a much abused world. And as you know, from this much abused world, we have also seen major scandals. The most prominent scandal, of course, is 1MDB. We've also had the Mara scandal, we've had the Tabung Haji scandal. So we have had numerous problems with this GLC world. I have to move quickly because what is important here now when we look at the GLC world is it draws attention to the public sector. How much coordination is there in the public sector? We've already heard how huge this public sector is. On here, try to capture this public sector in just this one diagram. So on the left, you have number one, the GLC world. Number two, there is a current policy planning structure. I'm not saying there isn't one. But what I'm also saying is, if you look at this world, we have the financial institutions like RFB Bank, Bank Islam. We have the development financial institutions like SME Bank, Agro Bank. We also have numerous training institutions, and you'll see much in the budget and in the in the stimulus packages about the need for skills training institutions. And we have the universities. Little has been said about the universities, but I'd like to stress this. The universities, there is far too many universities in this country. We've been talking about that. Why does the government continue to create these universities when we also know that only 49% of academics in this country have a PhD? We also know because of this, there are serious problems in terms of the quality of graduates that we are getting. There are serious problems here with the university system. The government does not want to relinquish control of the universities back to the academics to give us more authority. A big problem here. And what this means is the contribution by academics, by the universities to policy discussion. Is there a link between the government and the universities in terms of real policy research that feeds into our public policies, including the 12 Malaysia Plan? From my working with the government, I can tell you there is very little input based on research into public policies, and this is a major flaw with the making of public policies, which I think will be repeated in the 12 Malaysia Plan. I want to end with this. And I want to end with this because I'm speaking here to INSAP, which is owned by the MCA. China in Malaysia, and MCA has played a big role in bringing China into the Malaysian economy. We have just published a book by the same title, China in Malaysia. It's now out in the bookshops. Now here we are seeing a very new phenomenon. Government, strong governments, Chinese government, single dominant party, strong leaders, strongman leaders, Xi Jinping now talking directly to the strongman of Malaysia, Najib Razak, creating state-state ties and bringing their very powerful state-owned enterprises into collaboration with our very powerful GLCs. We have not seen this phenomenon before. And what we are seeing now here is a massive inflow of Chinese investments in this economy. I'm not saying they're all bad. In fact, some of them, our studies indicate, are very productive. But we've also seen other problems. We've seen the ECRL scandal. We have seen also the issue with for the city, Malacca Gateway. So much effort was put into Malacca Gateway, in which the MCA also played a big role in. And now it is brought to a standstill. These are major problems that we have to grapple with, and I have not heard anyone talking so far yet about Chinese investments in this country. But we also have the productive type, Huawei. We have Alibaba, which is doing some important things. I have to end here because I'm way beyond my limit, but I hope these are issues which the 12 Malaysia Plan will consider very carefully when they look into the major structural problems that have to be rectified. So far, I will say this, I want to end with this. What we have seen, it doesn't matter whether it was Pakatan, Barisan Nasional, or Pakatan. There's been no political will on the government to move away from race-based type discourses to an articulation of policies which is based on what this country really needs. The major structural problems which we need to address. We need to bring in all Malaysians into this process of resolving the structural problems, but we cannot do it if we continue with the type of policy plans that we have seen in the past, which may figure in the 12 Malaysia Plan. Okay, thank you, Dr. Wong.